What happens if we dare to tear off the mask of professionalism and actually risk showing up for real? I'm your host, Miriam Happiness, and this is Unprofessionalism.
You cannot create readiness for catastrophe, but I think what changed is that they felt included into this change that by design excluded them to begin with. And when they showed up with a fresh, beautiful haircut without talking to each other, that created some sort of unity. Even if nobody was going to know what was going to happen in those rooms, even if I was going into those rooms with them to find out what's going to happen to them the same day as them, just by looking at us, you could say that you could see that we were a team in this.
Donatella,
Miriam,
I am delighted to have you on the show.
I am super excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, curious what will come up. And we'll just dive into it.
Let's do it.
I'd like to invite you to share an anecdote with me of a time when you've been unprofessional.
That's a juicy one. Okay, so what comes to mind for me when I think of unprofessional is all those moments in which I was supposed to perform a certain way, and then I somehow figure out a different way to be there. And the first thing that happened in my mind when I think of unprofessionalism is a time when, so I used to be a team leader, right? I used to be a team leader in a large corporation at a time in which, like many companies go through these type of times, at a times of merger and acquisitions, right? So at a time in which there was like a lot of moving parts. And I remember in that specific phase, the way the change was managed internally in the company was in a way kept secret until the very end. Right. So even as a team leader, you really wouldn't have access to the information of what was going to happen. You were going to find out together with your own team the day of. Right. So obviously that is a specific way of managing change that doesn't bring many of the other people along that are not the people that decided on the change. Right. And I felt that lack of safety for myself as a leader, and I felt that lack of safety for my team as well. So what we did, I think we were probably a month out from D-Day. And in this situation, normally in organization, there's gossip, there's a lot of fear, there's assumptions, there is speculation, right? You cannot really stop that. I think that's a natural, organic thing. But what I started noticing in my team, which is like fear, right? So like just blunt fear, of course. And the fact that me as a leader couldn't really support them with transparency because I also didn't have the information. I remember all of a sudden one day I just came into the office and I was just like, listen, we're going to take a couple of days and we're going to book a co-working space and we're just going to spend 2 days reviewing your curriculum, like reviewing your portfolios, getting you ready for whatever happens next. I don't know, you don't know. And that somehow was an equalizer for us, right? Because we both were in a situation of asymmetry in a way. So that made it easier because the power dynamics all of a sudden became very different. I changed my role to a mentor, right? They changed their role to like very active participants into this change and no longer like passive receivers. And what happened is there was also like in this craziness of this catastrophe, there was also like some space for creativity, right? So we could imagine what would come next. We could have imagined that this catastrophe had already happened and then take back agency into our own hands. We didn't tell anyone about this 2 days retreat. I think that's what made it a little unprofessional at the time. Because it was difficult to justify in a way, like, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? This is not the right time. I don't know if other leaders would have thought that that was going to be a right move. right? Normally in these situations, there is a little bit of a hush-hush preference, right? Don't say anything, don't tell anything, don't involve anyone, lay low, right? Lay low. And what happened then was kind of a small miracle, because like attached to this small retreat, I also took the opportunity of an event that we were organizing and brought them to the mountains for one more day after that event, right? So there was the retreat first and then the expansion then. And I remember taking this photo at the time I was leading 4 people. I remember taking this photo of them on basically crossing a river, their back to the camera and their eyes on the horizon. And I remember taking this photo and send it to them as a little bit of a hopeful manifesto that this moment in which we could look beyond this, or this moment in which we could look above the challenge, could be there. And what happened was a little bit of I call it a small miracle, because it was right before the D-Day happened. A colleague told me a sports metaphor from football. And he was like, that's where we are right now. A football team, when you launch the ball, has to run towards the ball and make sure that they're even under the ball, right? So a ball was being thrown at us, and we were working together to be even under the ball, in a way, in formation, right? Waiting for this catastrophe to just land on us. And I will never forget the day of the D-Day, when everybody was convened to the office for this big layoff. Every single person of my team, without talking to each other, showed up with a haircut. It was like, for me, it was amazing, because basically what happened is like we were getting information to be even under this event. And at the same time, of course, you cannot create readiness for catastrophe. That's like, I'm not that arrogant that I think we can create readiness for catastrophe. But I think what changed is that they felt included into this change that by design excluded them to begin with. So that's kind of like started shifting things for me. And when they showed up with a fresh, beautiful haircut without talking to each other, literally they all went get a haircut before the D-Day. And that created some sort of unity, like even if nobody was going to know what was going to happen in those rooms, even if I was going into those rooms with them to find out what's going to happen to them the same day as them, just by looking at us, you could say that you could see that we were a team in this, even if we were about to be dismembered. And for me, that was just like a chill, thrill in the craziness moment that really, really helped all of us. Yeah.
Thank you. What I hear and admire is the courage to disregard a general practice of how an organization or how a team leader is supposed to deal with change, and especially with layoffs.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what often happens is that there's so much uncertainty and fear, as you said, but also the lack of agency also of the team leader.
Yes.
That you don't know what will happen to your team, and it almost disables everyone because you're not able to do any constructive, productive work in this time while waiting. Mm-hmm. And you not only took agency for yourself, but you distributed it to the team.
Mm.
And I think that's, for me, a beautiful example that even in a toxic organization, if we want to call it like that, there's still a small space where we can take decisions on whether we want to let in humanness.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And dignity.
Yes. Yeah, dignity is a good word for this.
Right.
Yeah.
What was going on in your mind in terms of the risk or the gossip of other team leaders or your boss in terms of judgment of this act?
That's interesting. Now that you're asking me this question, I realize I didn't think about it at all. I was like, well, let's just say I was in a little bit of in the chaos, I was in a little bit of a privileged position because I was an expat leader.
Mm-hmm.
So an expat leader normally with basically two reports. One was my immediate boss, who was in some ways herself a very permission to be unprofessional person,
Mm-hmm.
right? So already she had created this environment in which you really could have permission to be yourself, no matter what headquarter
Mm-hmm.
would think or do. And that created a lot of unity within the team because herself was bringing her whole self to work. So I didn't think about her permission because probably in the back of my mind, I was thinking, oh, she will be proud, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then I had another report, which was in headquarter, so far away. That was probably the one that I felt most at risk with, right? Also because, I was on a green card track and, I was on, I had something at stake that wasn't really just the work, right? It was like my whole livelihood. But I believe what helped was having conversations with headquarters in which it was clear that I didn't agree with this, right? So even if it was just a conversation, even if it was just a remark in a meeting, for me, it was a matter of relationally position myself in a way in which I wasn't kind of like betraying anyone. I was just like coherent, which is interesting because sometimes in organization, I've been so coherent with my performance. Then when I quit, for example, people didn't expect it.
Oh,
right?
mm-hmm.
Yeah, they totally did not expect it at all. Like, because I was performing well, right? So I was delivering. So there is something to say about the fact that like when coherence can stay and when coherence can hurt you. So it was interesting. So I think, yeah, these two factors. Like one, it was like a blind trust in the fact that, one of the two leaders would have understood because herself was a little bit of a riot,
Mm-hmm.
right? And the other thing is like just being very clear that, about my position in this process.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
And
just to help. Yeah.
yeah. And before I ask further about the reasons what actually made you quit at some point, I think that's very interesting. I am curious what the impact was then on your team, because you said that you moved from the position of a team leader to the position of a mentor. So suddenly you were eye to eye or at the same eye level, in a space that is very relational suddenly.
Yeah.
And then I don't know whether some team members indeed had to leave.
Mm-hmm.
And then how was it with those who stayed?
Yeah. I remember this moment. So of the 4 members of my team, 1 was let go.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that happened that I remember very clearly, like it's just like imprinted in my memory, is like the moment those meetings ended, we huddled. Like I think there was a moment in which I remember we were at this cafe outside of the office, and this person was mourning, obviously. And we were in a circle around her. That's it. I don't remember anything else. I remember the silence and I remember being there for them, with them. And I remember that moment. And that moment helped because then, of course, we all kind of put up a little bit of a fight, for example, to keep her on as a consultant.
Mm.
So that was something that, because specifically this person was somebody that has worked the longest with the organization. Yeah. And so her entire life her entire identity revolved around that job post. And I remember all of us had zero doubt in what we had to do after we huddled. And like, just there was an opportunity to fight for some people to become consultants after this. And it's good and bad, right? Because sometimes when layoff happens, and maybe even if they are in the number of hundreds, companies just cut and then think back that they cut too much and rehire, right? So what happens to belonging when you rehire? That's been a space of ambiguity that we had to live in for at least 6 months. Because how do you deal with all that loss and all that sadness?
Mhm.
And then all of a sudden, these people show up with a new role in 2 months. So was the company right to lay them off in the first place?
Mhm.
Were we betrayed by this process? How are they coming in now? Can they come in with the same level of trust that they came in before? Like, how are our relationships going to be affected? What can we say? What can we not say? Et cetera, et cetera. So those 6 months were, if you want, such an adjustment moment, but they also helped us to see the truth ultimately. Like, I think we were living in a little bit of a bubble
Mhm.
until this big disruption happened and all this like belonging dynamics just started surfacing. Right. And so that was the two things. It's like the huddle and the fact that we were completely aligned on the decision to try and fight. But at the same time, all of us needed to deal with the ambiguity of having now completely different belonging dynamics in the room. And I tell you one more thing, because it's important for context. Before the layoff, they left us in a room with boxes in an office, unfinished and undone, for more than 6 months. So you see how psychologically, I am not saying that was made on purpose. What I'm saying is the fact that nobody intentionally removed the boxes from the office that was going to be disrupted it felt like a choice. It felt like a
like
choice
being on hold.
Yeah, basically, like you're now entering the space of waiting.
Yeah.
And the space of irrelevance. This is where you are going to be living. And that was the hardest part. The hardest part was not understanding why nobody was finishing these works, why nobody was finishing up the office. Right? Then we understood, right? Nobody was finishing up the office because they were planning the layoffs. So of course, you wouldn't invest. But the fact that it was left for like more than 6 months, like we were working with boxes. Like imagine you're moving to a new house and you basically just like live within your boxes for more than a year. It gotta be a stressful situation, right? So there are these decisions or not decisions, like unintentional decisions, right? That happens that affect the whole process. And that's important to be intentional about. Yeah.
Yeah. And I can see how the process of planning the layoffs suddenly has a ripple effect on the entire organization through these small/big signs.
Correct.
And maybe it wasn't even planned, or they didn't think it's not worth it, but maybe it wasn't the priority anymore suddenly.
Correct. But for us, it was our entire day.
Feel it. Yeah. And then productivity reduces.
Yeah.
Obviously, because we don't have the same routine, we don't feel the same sense of safety, belonging.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. So those small decisions makes all the difference, and especially when it comes to endings, right? Yeah. And who participates.
And you spoke about the mourning, and you didn't say grief, but I think it's another word or concept that comes up for me that is, I think, highly neglected or underestimated in organizations, especially when it comes to change.
Yes.
So what have you learned from this experience about grief work in the context of change?
But to me, something was very clear through this experience, and it was that grief is a process that by design, especially like the larger the organization, right, the more accelerated the grief process is. So there is this forward thinking, right? There is this idea that when the meeting ends, we send the meeting notes, but we don't stay in the room to say what is finished, right? So that's pretty much what I've learned is like, okay, we are now accelerating towards the new beginning. But what is missed in the meantime, it's like it's the organization relationally can crumble and not be ready for this new beginning, right? Or perform readiness for the new beginning, which is even worse, like performing how ready we are for a new beginning without intentionally taking care of what actually happened in the process is what accelerates grief completely, right?
Can you explain this a little bit further?
So in a way, I think what I've noticed, there were consequences, for example, in that specific case to this acceleration, right? It was a moment in which new enthusiasm, for example, for new project was demanded. So this idea that like, okay, right, done, from now on, 3-year plan, right? Or there was a moment in which, because of course there was a shift in leadership happening, there wasn't a moment of integration of the new leaders, or there wasn't a moment of, okay, what are we ready to let go, what we don't want anymore, before moving on to the next phase. And I feel like it doesn't only happen in corporate. I think it's an attitude that we have towards work at some point, right? So I remember, I think what causes this ultimately is this assumption that when you work somewhere, belonging is a gift, right? So the company tells you, you are here, you should be grateful to work here, right? So this assumption that belonging is a gift, and me, the organization, are giving you the gift of giving you work. And this doesn't only happen in corporate. Like, I think I experienced this thing, like at some point when I shifted and became an independent entrepreneur, I won this business fellowship. And it was a business fellowship for like 100 women across Europe that actually won this business fellowship to be given mentorship, to be given advice, to be given an opportunity, et cetera, et cetera. And I remember the first meeting, 180 women. We were meeting in Madrid with the organization that organized all of this. And for me, belonging broke into 5 minutes into the speech when they got up on stage and be like, you've been chosen, you should be grateful, right? That was the moment in which like belonging completely broke for our group. And we had to spend a month rebuilding it because just for these small words, you should be grateful, for example, that you have a job, or after a layoff, that you still have a job, right?
That you have this fellowship. Now you have money, you got
Yes,
time,
yes.
you have advice.
So the you should be grateful enigma is what causes a lot of this. It's like in the way we consider belonging into organization, like what do we get wrong about belonging? It's like that there's a gift, right? And that is, but what that creates is a transaction.
Yeah. It reminds me of old school parents. As long as you're putting your feet under my table, you must be grateful and you do what I want.
Exactly. And then so the team, without taking care of the loss, is left in a state of performative gratitude. Right. So what happens then is I don't say what I need to say. I keep it for myself. And at some point, it will break again, right? So maybe it's not going to show up in a layoff. Maybe it's going to show up in disengagement. Maybe it's going to show up in people taking more leaves of absence. Maybe it's going to show up in people leaving the office at 5 or not saying the things that they need to say. Yeah.
What comes up for me is that gratitude and belonging are, as much as love, things that you cannot demand for.
Yeah.
You cannot force someone to feel belonging or to feel grateful. It's something that needs to grow and that needs to be genuine.
Yeah.
And then I think if we, as you said, it feels like transactional if we're asked to do that or to feel like this. And then it's almost a betrayal to ourselves.
Yeah.
And then disengagement, I think, is almost then natural to follow.
Yes. And again, like, and there is this type of disengagement. The first reaction, especially from team leaders, is like, oh, they don't understand. Oh, they don't, like the blaming, right? So ultimately, what I've learned that leaders are asking themselves are two things, like, I want to help and I don't know how, right? And the second question is like, who am I as a leader within this change if my team doesn't engage? So it is a matter of identity, even for the leaders, not only for the team. So that's the big equalizer. It's like there is a relationship between themselves in which structurally the company is telling you the leader is up here and the rest of the world is down here. But relationally, they're actually asking themselves the same question.
Yeah. And I wonder, the leader, especially in such a situation, the leader also often doesn't feel very safe or doesn't, as you mentioned, you didn't get more information. So then what is asked from you as a leader is not to belong to the organization because they don't communicate with you, but also you're not allowed to belong to your team because otherwise you get entangled and then the emotions and then you cannot separate or you cannot be professional when there are the layoffs.
Yeah.
And that's a very difficult situation to be in.
It is very difficult. And like what that situation taught me, combined with a lot of other things that then led me to quitting, is this mission that I gave myself to be like, okay, we are constantly stuck in between who we are at work and who we are at home. And when we come to work and some big disruption happens, who is building, in sociology, they're called the third spaces. Who's building these third spaces in which I am allowed to say things? I am allowed to participate in why we're doing things. I am allowed to redesign how we meet, right? I am allowed to be, kind of like myself without the obligation of the structure for a moment. But therefore, because I am allowed into this third space of dialogue or planning or design or strategy, I then can move the organization forward, right? Because I'm no longer stuck into this binary of like, who am I outside of here and who am I here? Like, so for me, belonging is very much this endless, beautiful, and at the same time exhausting, which, it's the paradox that we hold, negotiation between performance and presence. So how do we fill that gap between who I say I am or who am I performing to be and who I really am and what I can really give as a value, right? So that's, for me, kind of like put me into a quest a little bit because I was into that quest myself as a leader. I looked back and some of my writings from back then, and you could just I hated most of my journal pages from back then because I could sense how much I was trying to keep things under control. And because I was also into my own identity journey, like I finally quit when I wanted to ask myself the question, who am I without all of this? Right? So that was for me, it's always been like the quest. It's like everybody's quest is first like, who am I? And who am I versus you versus us versus them. Into an organization, it happens at the same level. It's always, we're always three people in the room, me, you, and the system. So that's kind of like the dynamic that I work on the most. Is like, now we're four people. Me, you, the system, and AI.
Yes.
Yeah. So how do we actually create that third space of possibility, ultimately, of agency, whenever we're stuck in between the other two? Like, who am I outside of here and who am I inside of here? At some point, it became so evident that there was a complete backlash or like a complete, how can I say, there was no longer a common ground between my value and the company values. That's where I called it quits. Yeah, that's where I called it quits.
And what gave you the courage to do that?
Well, in these situations, I guess it's not only a matter of courage per se, but for me, it was very much the context that helped me a lot because life threw so many curveballs at me until I saw that it was needed. So I quit when it became very evident that the cost of staying was higher than the cost of leaving. And that's a principle that I carry in the work I do now. Like that's the now what moment. There has to be a cost of staying that's higher than the cost of living for you to do that. And for me, it included three things. One, I had a landmark year, what I call a landmark year, in which everything crumbled. So in the midst of all of this, M&A situation, my mom got cancer, 6,000 miles away. She recovered, but it was a hard hit for me. I was, spending my days just like going to the office, a shaved head, going to the gym 5 times a week, just like protecting the team. So I was in that, kind of like a little bit of a war zone on my own. And then there were the 2016 elections. So I was in a green card route, and the green card was postponed 3 years, like for many immigrants. So I did no longer have that 6 months visibility into my life that I had before. Now it suddenly became 3 years. I had started to feel a little bit at odds with what I was doing, because all of this crisis pushed me into a role within the organization that wasn't a role that was designed for me, right? So I was a communication director, and all of a sudden I was moving into more of what I later called a facilitator position. I didn't know that was called a facilitator, right? But somebody who would actually be interested in designing the process to go through this change, rather than just producing the event or producing the outcome or producing the marketing campaign, right? So I tried to stay in that role that wasn't designed for me. I remember I have this orange slides presentation that I built as an internal pitch to my company of what role I could design for myself from now on. And I never sent it. I never sent it because it became so evident that no matter how much I tried to integrate this new identity in the context I was in, my identity and the context were not talking anymore. So I tried everything, as soon as I found out about what I later on studied, like design thinking, system thinking, and all of these methodologies that I now use, I just studied. And once I was ready, I tried to bring them back into the organization, but it wasn't the right time. I think timing and context matter in those type of decisions, because, fast forward a few years into the now, right? A few years after I left, 7 years after I left, yes, the company is now talking about design thinking. The company is now using that methodologies, but it wasn't the right time. We were too much in turmoil. We were too much in transition for what I was ready to do to be welcomed in that moment. So it's nobody's fault. It's just like there is an asymmetry at some point that it makes it so evident that is no longer your space. And then I had some, fortuitous help, like my apartment got flooded. And all of a sudden, a busted pipe in the kitchen. And I am all of a sudden spending 1 week into a Best Western hotel, the old ones with the carpet and, everything made of wood and very a bare room. And I remember that displacement really helped because it took me away from my reality for a second, forcefully a little bit, because of course the apartment was being fixed. And one day I woke up, and I used to live in California at the time. So really in a place that is probably the epitome of safety, right? I remember learning this data that in Laguna Beach, there are 12 police cars per person.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, nothing happened there. Like I lived in a place that had no cemeteries in sight, no senior living in sight. Like the idea of aging, death, and was just not present structurally in the environment.
Interesting.
And it was interesting because that was also affecting my team, right? The fact that something so disruptive would come in a culture in which disruption is not represented made it a cultural challenge for me as well. So I remember that day I woke up and there was a police car at the door and then a neighbor's door. And I was just like, how is that possible? Nothing happens in this place. And literally there was a SWAT team that was breaking into a house and catching a fugitive. I don't know. It was like from a movie or something. And I remember I looked at the window that morning. I remember I was rooting for the fugitive. Like in that moment, I was just like, I hope he makes it out, right? I wasn't just like, I hope they they catch him or her, I was just like, I hope they make it out. And then I was like, oh, I am that fugitive.
Oh.
And I am still in this house that I built for myself, which I no longer belong to. And that moment, I literally just like took my car, drive to the office and quit.
So you projected yourself on this
Yeah.
criminal. Wow.
Yeah.
Being
I think it's the
able to
first time that I
escape.
tell this story, that which eventually I would like to be my book one day. But anyway,
Wow.
yeah. Yes. I think it's a series of conditions that had to happen for me to reach that decision. And in the midst of all of this, I quit the rental apartment that I had because it was costing so much money.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to say it because it's important. I moved to a tiny house in the back of a bungalow and lived with 2 suitcases for 2 years because I wanted to save money. For what? I had no idea. I had no idea for what. I just needed to save this money because I knew a change was coming. I just didn't know what. So basically, when I quit, I had basically 2 years salary saving. Yeah, that allowed me then to move into my next life, which is the one.
Isn't it fascinating how the body knows it all?
Yes.
Without our mind noticing?
Yeah.
And then it's about listening and reading the signs before it's too late. Because luckily you didn't go into a burnout or any health crisis.
Well,
afterwards.
There was an undercurrent of that for sure. I think the way I dealt with that was I tried everything outside of my environment, which is very much what I now also bring into my programs. So it's this idea that for you to be able to actually embody your truth or actually feel your sense of belonging, sometimes you need to just to build a container that has nothing to do with what you're doing. So sometimes now the way I consider this unprofessionalism to be all right in the office is like, I did it for myself first, right? So I reinvented myself as a storytelling coach for artist friends. I don't know, profession that didn't exist, whatever. But I was just like, I need to try something different while I'm here. My friends were launching a startup. I was just like, can I consult for you for free, right? Or I went back to writing. And I booked every single possible writing retreat I could find because I was just like, that's my source of creativity. What if I don't let that go? What if I don't compromise? What if I move away a little from story selling and I try what it's like to have this identity for a minute? So the burnout that we're talking about, for me, it was really more of a burn in. It was just like, I needed to burn different things inside of myself to try different identities to see if I was even capable of doing that. And the way it shows up in offices right now when I do the same is like, sometimes I do programs in which I ask people to come into the room with no shoes on. Or sometimes I ask them to use their office spaces in a way they never used it before. People have baked bread in the office. People have created library nooks where there was nothing. And it's just like the sense of belonging has a lot to do with the sense of place and space and what you can do with that place and space as your ally rather than your routine. Right? So that third space that you can build of courage in the office can tell you way more about yourself and your team and you as a leader that then you can bring back to the PowerPoint, right? And then you can bring back to the meeting. So it is a lot about creating that community of courage for a moment that then you bring back. And it's almost like a test lab for belonging, right? So that's what actually I've seen working as a dynamic that is not so much just a methodology. It's more of a practice because as you said before, like belonging is not something you can have or something you can create. You can design the conditions for it to happen, but you cannot own it, right? So in designing these conditions, sometimes courage comes from how do you create a third space that allows you then to come back in your original two and do something different, do innovation, do change, do understanding. So that's how I
Yeah.
started. Well, yeah.
And what I hear is also a third space in order not to feel trapped
Yes.
in this
Exactly.
in this office or the routine or in this life, but to have a creative outlet
Yes.
that doesn't have to be quit your job and go to a writing retreat.
Absolutely not. Yeah, absolutely not. You can do it while you're in it, right?
Yeah.
So then we have to be okay with the fact that it might lead to quitting,
Mhm.
right? But that is always a possibility.
Mhm.
So you can either lead from the fear that it happens, or you can lead from the opportunity that it presents.
Mhm.
It's up to you, right? The fact that there is that opportunity is what needs to be spoken about in the room out loud.
Yeah.
If we ignore that opportunity or if we ignore that possibility, that's when belonging breaks.
Yeah.
Right? It's this idea that like belonging is what becomes possible when you actually stop pretending that the tensions are not there.
Yeah. And I just wonder what would have happened if the new role hadn't been just put upon you but created with you, because as you
Correct.
described, it's now you're doing exactly what was presented to you 7 years ago, but the organization wasn't ready and you weren't empowered to actually grow into it and maybe make the organization ready faster than 7 years.
Yes, for sure. That's the whole point, right? It's like there are all these opportunities are always lingering.
Yeah.
And it's up to us to design the conditions for them to emerge, or we can ignore them. And that's okay. Like you survive, but from surviving and thriving, there's a difference.
Yeah.
Most of the thing that I design for and I help people to design for is aliveness instead of numbness. That's the biggest shift. Like if I had to sum up everything that I've done in other organizations or neighborhoods or foundations or communities, it doesn't matter the environment. The biggest shift is from numbness to aliveness. It's basically a little bit of a refusal, right? So you refuse to believe that there's only one option in going into this. So when you open that optionality, what becomes possible? And again, like if we think about technology that way, that's also an optionality, right? It's not, but of course, our first reaction is enemy or ally, right? Our first reaction is always binary. But even in saying that that's normal and that's okay, we react to that binary because we are afraid, and that's fine. It just, there is a progress that can be made in between these two ways. And there is always that third way that can be built. And if it's built together, it stays. If it's built alone, it crumbles. It's quite simple. But like many simple things, they're the toughest to embody and listen to. Yeah.
Thank you. What is an unprofessional advice that you would still give others?
I think like a lot of the work that I do has to do with permission, right? So sometimes I am the person that comes in the room and helps the leader and the team have permission to talk or permission to do or permission to say. How can you give yourself that permission changes everything? For me, the permission to be afraid was important. The permission to say that things ended was as important. So find a friend that you can tell these things to, so then they become evident, like they're no longer, brewing inside of you, they become transparent. And I have these songs that I keep going to in whenever you feel like you don't belong. And it's the Try Everything from Shakira, which I think was the Olympic Games song. If I'm not wrong, now that I think about it. So it's this idea that like whenever you're in a situation in which there is a certain structure or a certain environment or a certain context that makes you believe that belonging means sameness, that belonging means continuity, right? That is not necessarily true. We are building each other up to, I don't know, in organization, for example, teams that are probably becoming more and more of task force, reorg that are continuous. So belonging is temporary now, right? It's no longer about, hey, it is a gift to work here and you should be grateful, right? It is about permission to experiment and go in and out. So we always have permission to go in and out. It's how we do it that changes everything. So as long as you give yourself permission without hurting others, I think you're good. So it's a try everything without hurting others. I think that's the unprofessional advice that I can give. Yeah.
So much food for thought.
Thank you for this. It's been so interesting to look at belonging through the lens of unprofessionalism, because sometimes, I realized, thank you to your stimuli in thinking about this, that sometimes belonging could be the most unprofessional thing you could do, And I love this lens so much, and that you created this space for something so unnamed, again, that once it gets named, I think it's creating a rally of people and be like, yes, I see myself in this. I see myself in this. And so I thank you for this space, because I think you're creating that third space, right? That third space in which you can actually say out loud, this is a good thing, right? Whenever we choose presence over performance, and it can be called unprofessionalism sometimes, it is a good thing. And so I'm grateful that you gave this a name. You have me feel seen.
This was a conversation without the script. Now it's your turn. I'm Miriam Happness, and this has been Unprofessionalism.